If you cut this worm in half, it'll become 2 worms. If you chop its head in 2, it'll grow 2 heads. If you cut out its eye, it'll grow a new one. Put a new eye instead of the missing one, and it'll work. In today's video, you'll see some creatures that always have a backup plan in case they die. Decapitation is a process that usually cannot be reversed. That is, once you cut off someone's head, this is it. But for some species of worms, losing a head is no problem at all. They just grow a new one. And a recent study has shown that this superpower is not an ancient skill. Worms learned to grow new heads and a new brain only 10 to 15 million years ago. Yes, by the standards of the universe, that's quite recently. Of the 35 species of ribbon worms that scientists have studied, only 5 can regrow heads, and that's odd too. Usually, closely related species evolve in the same way.
So good. So good and tasty.
Meanwhile, some not-so-distant cousins of ribbon worms, known as flatworms, paid a visit to the International Space Station. What they did up there was truly astonishing. One of these space worms actually had a piece of its body cut off only to grow a head in its place, even though it already had one. The worm ended up growing 2 heads, one on each side, which is an extremely rare form of regeneration that scientists had never seen before. It's not entirely clear what triggered this strange phenomenon, but there are a few theories. Some believe it might have something to do with changes in the Earth's magnetic field, gravity, or the stress of takeoff and landing that the worm experienced on the International Space Station. Basically, all the stuff that comes with space travel. Speaking of which, scientists sent these worms into space to see how the unusual environment would affect them. But no one expected this. Interestingly, when the space worms returned to Earth, they had some other differences from the earthworms, but those aren't as intriguing as having 2 heads. But if you thought the idea of a creature growing a second head was already incredible, hold on tight, because there's more to it. Scientists have found that a certain flatworm can regrow the head and brain identical to those of a different worm species. Yes, you heard that right. It can literally grow someone else's head.
You have any idea how much that stings?
Not on purpose, though, and definitely not by choice. Researchers stepped in to help in this peculiar environment. By tweaking some connections that let cells communicate using electrical signals, scientists managed to reshape the worm's head and brain to resemble those of other species. There are 4 different worm species in this photo. The experiment was carried out on the leftmost one. And here's the same leftmost worm now shaped like other worm species. And although scientists intervened in the regeneration process, in fact, the changes were made without any manipulation of the genome. It's important to clarify that the worms didn't just have differently shaped heads, their brains were also changed. The most intriguing aspect for me was that these changes weren't permanent. In as little as 30 days, without any human intervention, the worms reverted to their original heads. It makes me wonder if they even noticed the difference. You may be wondering how worms manage to stay alive without their heads. I mean, they've got to stay alive first before they can even think about growing a new head, right? Well, it's a bit like some animals can survive getting their heads chopped off, but not the whole growing it back part. What about breathing? It's pretty straightforward. Planarians are so thin and flat that they don't need lungs or a heart to suck in oxygen and pump it around their bodies. They just let oxygen in and let carbon dioxide out right through their body walls by diffusion. No extra organs needed. Talking about food, planarians have an unusual approach. They start by growing a special tube for digestion, and, well, their mouth isn't exactly up in their head. You can clearly see it here. The worm is munching on the beef liver that the researchers placed out for it. Through this same opening, the creature both eats and, well, does its business. It might not sound very clean, but worms aren't exactly known for being fussy. However, eating food is simple, but the worms must find it first. They don't rely solely on their eyes. They can pick up on chemical signals too. In other words, they don't really need a head. Plus, worms often live in dark, moist spots shielded from direct sunlight, so if they find themselves in the light, all they need to do to stay safe is to head back into the dark. No head required. Furthermore, planarians display the remarkable ability to detect light even without a brain. Scientists uncovered this intriguing phenomenon through a series of experiments. Initially, the worms had their heads removed and were placed in a dark environment where they remained still. However, when the light was switched on, they promptly ran away, as much as worms can run, that is. This sheds light on their visual capabilities, specifically their sensitivity to UV light. It's worth noting that these creatures lack the capacity to perceive colors as humans do, let alone see objects in the distance. This incredible ability to detect light only kicks in when worms become adults. Newly hatched worms couldn't pick up on UV light after losing their heads, hinting that light-sensing cells in worms take some time to develop. It could be a sign of their maturity. The researchers also discovered that when untouched planarians were in a restful, sleep-like state, they perked up in the presence of UV light, even if they didn't react to other things they could see. It might not seem exciting, but consider this. Why would these little worms have such an ability? It seems that being sensitive to light all over their bodies helps protect the sleeping worms from harmful UV rays. Such a mechanism may be distinctly advantageous to a water-dwelling, light-aversive organism that's likely nocturnal and would rest during the day, the scientists wrote. If you didn't get what I just said, I'll put it in simple terms. While the worm sleeps, its body moves on its own to get to a safe place. That's why the worm needs to see things with its entire body. Actually, since we're talking about the strange, outright incredible regeneration of worms, we should definitely mention their ability to regenerate from a tiny piece. Literally. A piece of planarian without a tail and a head can grow back to the original size in just 3 weeks. And it's amazing to watch this process. Just imagine, you take a worm, cut it into 4 pieces, and each of them becomes a complete animal after a while. In the first week, 2 tiny spots appear on a piece of planarian. New eyes grown from scratch. But the planarian, if you can still call it that, still looks like a blob. But a blob with eyes isn't the weirdest thing ever. By day 12, the blob has already grown a new head and a new tail, both translucent. After another week, they turn brown. By this point, the planarian can already eat using a white, muscly tube called the pharynx, which acts like a vacuum cleaner, extending out from the body and sucking up bits of food. Yes, this is the same tube that gets food in and waste out. Why grow extra organs when one can do the trick? Comparing these processes to human regeneration, it starts to look like planarians are in a league of their own. When we suffer significant injuries, the best outcome we can hope for is the healing of wounds. Regrettably, if we lose a limb, it won't magically grow back. Moreover, a human arm or leg doesn't magically create a whole new person in just 2 weeks or even 10 years. Human healing primarily focuses on closing wounds and removing debris, making it a relatively short process that doesn't involve tissue replacement. In contrast, planarians are experts at tissue replacement, and that's something we humans can only wish for. Planarians owe their remarkable regenerative powers to special cells called pluripotent stem cells, which make up about 1/5 of their bodies and have the unique ability to develop into any body part, but only within a single planarian. Interestingly, humans also have these cells, but they're active during the embryonic stage, helping us grow organs and body parts before birth. Once we're born, this ability wanes, although we can still regenerate to some extent. For example, our liver and bone marrow can regenerate, as can the outer layers of our skin and the inner layers of our intestines. However, our regenerative capabilities are nowhere near as impressive as those of planarians. But not all worms are that good at regeneration. If you take a regular earthworm, for example, and cut it in half, you can't get 2 complete organisms. That is, the head of the worm can survive and regenerate the tail, but it won't be able to grow a new head from the original tail, let alone the rest of the vital organs. Instead, the tail part of the worm will die. Flatworms, which we mentioned quite a lot today, are a completely different matter. They can regrow from just a tiny piece, no matter where you cut it from. This piece will then grow to become a complete worm. Some flatworm species can use regeneration to reproduce without going through the mating process. It's pretty basic. These asexual flatworms just split themselves into 2 halves and grow 2 new worms. What's really intriguing is that within the same species, you've got flatworms who use traditional reproduction, like mating and laying eggs. So while some of these worms do that, others just go for the simple split and grow approach. It's really weird, even for scientists. What's even weirder is that flatworms can recover not just their heads with brains, but also their memories. Experiments show that flatworms can remember trained behavior even after decapitation. What's even weirder is that flatworms can recover not just their heads with brains, but also their memories. Experiments show that flatworms can remember trained behavior even after decapitation. Scientists did an experiment where they taught these flatworms to find food on a rough surface, and then they chopped off their heads. In 2 weeks, the worms grew new heads, and guess what? They still remembered how to navigate the rough course. Imagine how surprised the scientists were. It seems that some memories of the acquired skill lived in the bodies of these worms even after their heads were cut off. That is, they were obviously not stored in the head.
But where then?
Next thing, you're going to ask me if these worms can borrow someone else's memories. Well, turns out they can. There was a study done in the 50s and 60s that proved very controversial. Millions were spent on further research in this area, although scientists were skeptical of the results, and you're about to see why. It went like this. A scientist taught some flatworms to crunch under light, which was easy because these creatures aren't too keen on bright light. Next up, he fed some of these trained worms to a different bunch of flatworms known for their cannibalistic ways. Oddly enough, these worms had never learned to avoid light, but after feasting on their enlightened relatives, they began mimicking their behavior. A bit later on, there was another test involving a maze. The worms that didn't know their way around the maze figured it out after eating bits of worms that had already learned the ropes. Basically, they not only got some nutrients, but also picked up the memory. The scientists who conducted these experiments concluded that some memories are stored in the nervous system. Interestingly, despite the initial buzz, other scientists couldn't replicate the results, and eventually the whole idea of gaining memories by eating was forgotten. Quite ironic, isn't it? Immortal worms. Forget expensive lotions and potions, the key to immortality may be found in flatworms. Scientists have discovered that these worms, which live in lakes and ponds, have the remarkable ability to regenerate over and over again. That is, the worms literally live forever. Researchers at Nottingham University managed to create a thriving colony of over 20,000 worms, all originating from a single original. Remember how a flatworm can split into two complete? This very process created 20,000 worms in just 4 years. Scientists believe that an individual worm, if it doesn't split, can live indefinitely as long as it stays healthy and free from infections or diseases. The key to flatworm immortality is telomeres, tiny biological clocks that cap the ends of chromosomes. Normally, they get shorter over time, stopping cell division and renewal and causing the body to age. But in flatworms, telomeres remain intact, allowing cells to divide repeatedly, stopping aging. So flatworms are sort of like elves in Tolkien's universe. I imagined them a little differently. Going solo. Scientists have discovered a hermaphrodite flatworm that literally resorts to self-insemination when it can't find a mate. It can utilize this reproductive strategy because it has both male and female sex organs. While this does produce inbred offspring, it's still better than not being able to continue the species at all. After all, giving offspring is the primary purpose of most living organisms. Normally, these flatworms reproduce by exchanging genetic material with other worms, but as part of the study, one worm didn't have a mate, so it decided that its own head would do for fertilization. Still better than nothing, right? And it's the first time anything like this has ever been observed, by the way. No guts, no problem. Typically, most living creatures have a more or less consistent set of organs. But not too long ago, researchers stumbled upon a rather peculiar flatworm. This worm doesn't have a mouth, rear end, or any guts to speak of. Surprisingly, these shortcomings haven't slowed it down. Scientists have uncovered that it manages to survive thanks to a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that reside inside it. This partnership has worked so well that they've been at it for over 500 million years. Worms will save us. You've got to admit it sounds pretty reassuring. We now know that flatworms, like planarians, can actually grow back body parts when they've been chopped off. And it's not just body parts. They can make entire new creatures from scratch. Long story short, scientists are thinking of using this to study how our own tissues can regenerate. Recently, they identified a special kind of stem cell in flatworms that helps them regrow heads, brains, and other tissues. The idea is that understanding this could help us control cell regeneration in humans, which could help with all sorts of medical issues like birth defects, injuries, or even cancer. Now, it might take a while before they figure out how to make this work for us, but here's the kicker. They've been studying these special stem cells called neoblasts in flatworms since the late 1800s, and only recently have they made some big discoveries. So who knows, we might be closer to curing all sorts of diseases than we think. This research could potentially offer a pathway to immortality, or at the very least help people maintain their youthful energy and delay aging. That's certainly a good thing.
And then we need to figure out ways to make life more exciting, because a few centuries could start feeling pretty dull.
See you later.